Okay, we are in chapter 5 of Luke. Okay, verse 27. After these things, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he left all, rose up, and followed him. Sitting in the tax office means he's probably collecting customs taxes on goods that are arriving in Herod Antipas's kingdom. He's got a really good job, and it took him a really long time to get there. And it was a very, very big step for him to walk away from that, because the fishermen, like Peter and Andrew and James and John, those guys could all go back to fishing if it didn't work out with Jesus. And in fact, they did just that between the crucifixion and the resurrection. As soon as Jesus was crucified, they took off back to fishing. But Levi, or Matthew, he has both names, Levi would never be able to reestablish the connections and the credibility and the reputation that would be necessary in order to get him back into his profession. So when he walked away for good. And it was from a very well-paying job that he spent his entire life preparing for. And now he is never going to be able to go back to it. So it's a really big step for him. Then Levi gave him a great feast in his own house, and there were a great number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them. And the scribes and the Pharisees complained against his disciples, Jesus' disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Okay, so we have a big feast in Levi's house. Meal scenes are very important to Luke. Feasting, or eating together in general, was an act that traditionally symbolized the institution or renewal of a covenant. You feasted after you performed sacrifice. So when you went to the temple with your sacrifice, there were parts of the animal that were burned on the altar and fully consumed by the fire. Then there were parts of the sacrifice that were cooked on the altar and then given to different people. There were parts that belonged to the priests, because the priests, that was their job, so they were paid with food. So they received a certain portion of the sacrifices, most sacrifices. Some of them were not to be eaten. But for the most part, the sacrifices that were done in the temple were not just, let's kill an animal and burn it all completely. It involved a meal. It involved a feast of some kind. Because when you do a covenant, when you initiate a covenant, when you memorialize a covenant, when you celebrate a covenant, you do it with eating between the people who made the covenant. So in the case of sacrifices, you are sacrificing an animal, and the part that you burn completely is God's portion. And since he isn't an anthropomorphic figure who actually eats things, they describe it as that's the portion he gets to smell it. The smell of it goes up to heaven. So that's God's portion, and then your portion you take and you eat. And that's renewal of the covenant.
As far as feast goes, majority of the time, not all the time, but majority of the time, those sacrifices are to be eaten before morning.
Yes. Yes, there is
So there's significant feasts. They're not just feasts.
Yeah.
And involved a lot of people too.
Yes. There is one kind of sacrifice that can be eaten the next day, but it is not to be eaten more than one day after. The rest of it has to be disposed of after the next day. the priests are allowed to eat
And
it the next day.
In Judaism, is that kind of ritual around food and eating still very much embedded?
Yes. Well, yes, it is. It's also embedded just into culture. I mean, when do you feast? You feast at weddings. There's a covenant there.
Yeah, no, I know for that bit. I meant the not being able to eat it the next day.
Oh, not being able to eat it the next day? I don't think so. On like Passover, yes. On the specific feasting holidays, yes. You can't save it till the next day. But as far as general food,
Christianity, you do.
Christianity's not really big on feasts.
No, but if you're having a wedding or your Christmas or your Easter, you don't go, oh, we can't leave any for leftovers for tomorrow.
No, no, we don't worry so much about that. The leaving the leftovers for tomorrow was on foods that you had sacrificed. So if you sacrifice it, then you have to finish it that day. With a wedding, or a funeral, or another situation where God was expected to show up, it's not necessarily that you sacrificed the animal and then you didn't go do a sacrifice as part of your wedding ceremony, but you had a feast, and the feast was there to commemorate the covenant that was being made between the two people, at which God was expected to show up to bear witness to this covenant that was being made between the two people. So Levi here was probably just throwing a party without a whole lot of consideration for the
Jewish tradition.
Yeah, well, without a whole lot of consideration for the covenantal aspect of what he was doing, but that covenantal aspect, the theological significance of this feast that Jesus participates in, is probably not lost on Luke, because Luke finds meal scenes to be very important. All right, and the Pharisees complain against the disciples. Probably these guys are not standing at the door. This is probably after the fact. And they're I'm sorry?
What's their call? Who are the Pharisees today again?
The Pharisees are the teachers of the law. They are the Pharisees are the ones who they have the oral law, the oral traditions. They are the scholars. They are the people who really study their scriptures, who feel that they can, if they could just do everything that they were told to do by God in the law, if they could just follow God hard enough and love people the right way and do all of the things that they're supposed to do, if they could just do everything right, then surely the Messiah would come. As opposed to the Sadducees, who are focused on, they are the priests and they are focused on the religious ceremonies. If we could just get all of the sacrifices done perfectly, if we could just make sure that everybody was doing all of the sacrifices that they needed to do, and everybody was completely following all of the religious ritual, then surely the Messiah would come. So there is a great argument to be made, that was made actually by my professor, Brad Young, that Jesus was a Pharisee. because when you had a choice between being a Pharisee or a Sadducee, which school of thought did you follow? Well, the Pharisees were in the majority, and then you had the hierarchy of the different levels of involvement, but as far as thought goes, Jesus prescribed more to the Pharisaical thought, the thought of the oral law, and studying out God's law, studying out God's plan, his relationship with people, as opposed to just follow the rituals. He was definitely not a follow the rituals type of person.
You're saying, from what I understand, and this is probably wrong, that Pharisees, for example, when it comes to resurrection or raising the dead, for example, the Pharisees did not follow that, where the Sadducees did.
Other way around.
Other way around, is it?
Yep. The Sadducees did not, and again, to quote Dr. Brad Young, the Sadducees did not believe in life after death, so they were sad, you see.
Oh, okay. Right.
They were sad, you see, because when they were going to die and stay dead. So they were sad.
That's an interesting way to put it.
that was Dr. Young for you. Paul was a Pharisee. Before he was Paul, he was a Pharisee. So he
better call Saul.
Was very well educated in the law, and he was a scholar. Okay, so these guys are complaining against the disciples. They're complaining against the disciples, and Jesus is responsible for the disciples' actions because he is their teacher, and that is the way that the Pharisaical thought goes. The teacher is responsible for the actions of the students, which is still a prominent thought in our culture today. If you have a kid who is unruly, it's you do blame the parent to some extent, where you say, well, that whether it's right or wrong, you say, well, that parent never taught that kid how to behave. So that's the idea that's going on here too. The complaint is made against the disciples. Jesus is the one who's ultimately responsible for them. Jesus answers the Pharisees directly, though, with the implication that he took it very personally. This was not just about the disciples. They were talking to the disciples, but Jesus answers and says, hey, look at me. I am the physician. I have not come to call the righteous. He doesn't even reference the disciples, doesn't reference their actions, points the Pharisees who are criticizing them straight to him. And he's going to do this again and again in his interactions. The Pharisees will repeatedly go to the disciples and say, why are you doing this? And Jesus here in Luke's account will repeatedly come and say, hey, look at me. I'm going to answer you directly. All right, verse 33. Then they said to him, why do the disciples of John often fast and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink? And he said to them, can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days. Okay, and then we're going to get into a parable. So let's just talk a little bit about fasting first. Fasting was a...
Hang on a minute.
Yep.
You said bridegroom. I thought we were just having a feast. I didn't realize it was a wedding. Where did I miss the wedding part?
There wasn't a feast of a wedding. There was... Levi invited Jesus over for a party. A feast party that
so why
he
are we
was
talking
throwing.
about bridegroom?
It's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor.
Oh, okay.
He's using a metaphor. Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? And the question the question is it purely a metaphor in the sense of it's no more appropriate to rob the disciples of their joy than it would be to fast at a wedding? Or is Jesus somehow referring to himself? Is Jesus the bridegroom? And a lot of times we take that for granted as Christians, that of course Jesus is the bridegroom. We have a lot of discussions about the Messianic banquet, the Messianic feast, Jesus as the bridegroom coming for his bride, the church. We know all of these. We have all of these parallels in our thinking. We line all of these ideas up. But the Messiah had never been referred to as a bridegroom at this point. But Yahweh was. Yahweh was referred to as bridegroom quite frequently.
Here we go.
Because Yahweh was had the wife of
The children of
Israel, Judah, who was adulterous, and that whole thing that his people were adulterous. So he was often portrayed as being a bridegroom, but the Messiah was not specifically portrayed that way. Did you find something?
Yeah, it's okay, so if the Pharisees, is it Pharisees? Yeah. Pharisees? Yeah. If the Pharisees are addressing Jesus' disciples at this point, it says, can you make the guest of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? So he's addressing, saying the guest is the disciples, the bridegroom is Jesus. In this particular case, if that's the way. In my version here, it doesn't actually lay that out exactly that. In my version, it says the bridegroom is probably the tax collector. That's how this one is actually, again. Can you make the guest of the bridegroom? So the guest is Jesus. The bridegroom at this point, according to this book,
would be Levi. Is possible.
Fast while he is with them, and the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days they will fast. Now that second part doesn't relate exactly, but this say here, because it says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples. Okay, so it says to his disciples, why do you eat and drink, tax collectors? Jesus answered them. So that statement, I didn't read that just before actually. They said to him, John, so on. So, yes, can you make the guest of the bridegroom? So, even though Levi invited Jesus into his house to have a feast, Jesus is saying that he is the bridegroom and the tax collector is the guest, as well as the disciples.
I'm with Graham on that, because Levi Matthew is the one that's hosting this. This is his feast. This is his home.
Okay. Well, we don't know that this was still on the same occasion. Who is Levi marrying?
Like you said, it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Wow, oh yeah, actually, yeah, alright.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
but who is the bridegroom? I mean, the reason why we can draw the association between Jesus and Jesus being the bridegroom in our Christian understanding of it is because
the massive amounts of doctrines that come with it.
Well, not even just the doctrines. Going back to the Old Testament, like I was saying, that Yahweh was seen as the bride, or as the husband.
Yeah.
So Yahweh was the bridegroom. We can associate Jesus with Yahweh and say that he is also the bridegroom, or we can look at the church as being the bride of Christ through Paul's theology, and we can derive it that way. So there's at least two different ways to derive that. And I can see the relationship between the feasting that they're doing with Levi and this. I still think it's probably two different occasions that this is being discussed, because they're irritated. The Pharisees are irritated with them because they're eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners. And then they're saying, why aren't you fasting right now? Why are you eating with them instead of fasting right now? Or is this a completely separate attack? It reads to me like it's probably a separate discussion. I mean, fasting was a pretty common practice. You had, the whole nation would fast on certain days. So, like, on the Day of Atonement, or there was when they celebrated they celebrated the destruction of Jerusalem. No, they remembered the destruction of Jerusalem. They would fast for 4 days in memory of that. And then the Pharisees had weekly fasts that they would do, and voluntary fasting that would be done in addition to that. And Jesus also fasted. But they weren't questioning Jesus and whether or not he was fasting. They were questioning the disciples. So why are the disciples not following? Why are they not doing what disciples should be doing? But Jesus fasted too during the temptation in the wilderness, and also he made a vow at the Last Supper that he would not take the wine again until he took it in heaven. And he also gave lots of advice on fasting. So he may have fasted quite a lot, and so did his disciples. It's quite possible, but they just didn't see it. I choke on the idea of Levi as being the bridegroom, because who is he marrying to take responsibility for?
Yeah, because it never mentions anything about him being married ever again, or even here doesn't mention that really.
Well, and he was just throwing a feast.
Yeah.
He was just throwing a feast for them. The days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. They will fast in those days. So if this is just a metaphor, then he's just saying fast after the wedding, because it's not appropriate to fast during a wedding. If it is prophetic about Jesus, it may reflect the taking away of the suffering servant that's mentioned in Isaiah 53 verse 8. And it also has an interesting parallel in 4th Ezra, which is not a canonical book. It's not part of the Bible, but it is part of Jewish text, ancient Jewish text that we have available to us. And in 4th Ezra, there is a woman who represents Israel whose son dies on his wedding night, and she vows not to eat or drink anything else until she eventually dies. This could be a parallel to the idea of the bridegroom being taken away and then they fast. There is a possibility with that. If this sort of fasting has anything to do with the early church, though, it should be noted that when the early church, the Christian church, fasted, it was not to mourn for the absence of Jesus. It was usually accompanied by prayer and guidance and help us to hear more. It wasn't a fasting out of mourning. Okay. Then a parable, verse 36. He spoke a parable to them. No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one, otherwise the new makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And then another parable. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires the new, for he says the old is better. Okay. So, Luke goes right into the set of two parables that we have to try to interpret in context. So, in the context of what he is saying. The new garment, talking about the new garment, or the new piece on an old garment. Okay, the new garment gets torn, so it's destroyed. And the old garment doesn't look right with a new patch on it, so it's useless too. You want to fix an old garment, so you take a new garment, you cut it up to get a new patch. So you cut up a perfectly good new garment to get a patch out of it and try to stick it on the old garment. So now the new garment is destroyed, and the old one doesn't look right with the new patch, so it's useless too. And the old and the new are incompatible. It's not that the old is better or the new is better, but they are incompatible. Is one superior to the other, in this case, the old or the new? You can make an argument either way.
Well, no. Just like you said, they're individuals. The old garment is the old, the new one is the new. They are incompatible, which means that you can't patch an old garment with a new thing.
And the old one needed a patch, so presumably the new one was superior before it got caught up. But at the same time, the old one was worth patching, whereas the new one wasn't even worth keeping intact. So, whichever...
The new one's now ruined, so it's not superior.
Yeah, the new one is now ruined. But even when it was perfectly good, it wasn't as good as the old one, or we would have just used the new one instead of the old one. But we didn't want to use the new one. We wanted to fix the old one, because the old one was more comfortable. So, there's which one is superior is quite subjective. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Fermentation releases gases that cause a container to swell. So old wineskins are not as pliable as new wineskins. So when you put the wine in and it starts to ferment, it needs a new wineskin in order to be able to expand with it. And again, both the new and the old are ruined. The new wine is ruined and the old skins are ruined. Is one superior to the other in this instance?
Apparently so.
Why would it be apparently so?
Because it says no one drinks old wine and then immediately wants the new wine because it says that the old is better.
But does that mean that the old is better?
I mean, if everyone thinks so, it's likely.
The person who favors the old doesn't ever drink the new to compare it.
Okay.
He drinks the old wine, and then he doesn't want to try the new wine. So how does he know that the new wine isn't as good or better than the old wine? He never tries it. We don't know which is superior.
I mean, I suppose that's a valid argument, but at the same time, just in general knowledge today, most people would concede that old wine is generally better than new wine because new wine hasn't really fermented for as long.
Yeah, but he doesn't try it. He doesn't taste it. Anybody would look at the garments and say a new garment is better than an old garment too. But if the new garment is so much better than the old garment, why are we even bothering to try to fix the old garment? Well, because we want the old garment. Those pair of jeans, man, that was the best pair of jeans I ever had. I was going to wear that until I couldn't wear it anymore because they were so comfortable. So I'd do whatever I had to do to keep those jeans intact. Because that pair of jeans was worth 10 pairs of jeans that weren't as comfortable. So a case could be made. It's not about the superiority of one or the other.
It's all about change.
It's just, yes, the incompatibility of the old and the new.
Yeah.
If you try to make old and new compatible, then you're going to end up with destroying them both. They're incompatible. It's not that one is good and the
Yeah.
other is bad.
And
They're just incompatible.
That would be it, yes. If you try and mix the old with the new, you'll end up wrecking both.
If you try to teach an old dog new tricks, you'll just give him a heart attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 6. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them together in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" But Jesus, answering them, said, "Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those who were with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." So again, we have this issue of the Pharisees scolding the disciples, and Jesus saying, "Hold up, look at me." He's stepping in to put a buffer between them.
Excuse me, princess.
The first Sabbath would have been the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So this is the week after. That happened in the week of the second Sabbath after the first. It's awkward wording for us in English. But the first Sabbath would have been the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So this is a week later. Corn would have been ripe then. That's probably what they were doing. What are they were eating? What are the Pharisees mad about? What were they doing that wasn't allowed? Go ahead.
Doing work.
What kind of work?
Work on the Sabbath.
What kind of work on the Sabbath?
Thrashing. Picking.
Oh, yes. Well, gleaning from the fields was allowed, but plucking grain on the Sabbath might have been considered harvesting, which was not allowed. And even in that case, you could still make a case that they weren't harvesting, they were just putting food into mouth, except that they were rubbing the grain in their hands, and that was forbidden, because food for the Sabbath had to be prepared the day before so that no work would be done. So even more than that, actually, rabbinic law said that you had to, the day before the Sabbath, you had to also have an extra meal prepared in case a traveler passed through the town. Because if a traveler passed through the town, you had to be able to feed them. Now, the curious thing about that is, why is there a traveler passing through the town on a Sabbath? But, indeed, you had to have an extra meal prepared in case a traveler passed through the town. So, okay, so,
All tradition.
Pharisees.
On the Sabbath, it is unlawful to press the lift button.
Oh. Yeah.
Some people take it to extremes. So yes, if in some modern way thinking is that if you operate a lift and you press the button on the lift on the Sabbath, it is considered work.
But isn't it more work to climb stairs?
No, you have to wait, and that's what, from what I understand, people will wait until someone else enters the lift for them and asks them to press a button.
That would be the ultra-Orthodox Judaism, because most Jews are not that,
Insane?
It's But
rigid.
because what's the definition of work?
Yep.
And that's what it comes down to. That was their interpretation of work and pressing a button.
So in Mark, this challenge, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath, goes to Jesus. But in Luke, again, it's to the disciples, and then Jesus is stepping in to defend them. This is a continuous thing that we will see Luke emphasizing. So the story that he is talking about here comes out of 1 Samuel 21. Where David came and he was running away from Saul and went into the house of God, and he went and said, "Do you have any food?" And they said, "Nope, all we've got is this sacrifice food, this special bread that you're not allowed to eat because only the priests are allowed to eat it." And he said, yep, I want that. We need to eat it lest we die. So, please.
If I remember correctly, he basically said, "And you're going to let us eat it lest you die."
Well, we can read it quickly. It's in 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 9. I'll just read it real quick. David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" So David, running away from Saul, said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business," lying, "and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or what I have commanded you, and I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found." And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread if the young men have at least kept themselves from women." Then David answered the priest and said to them, "Truly women have been kept from us since about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel on this day." So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on a day when it was taken away. And then he also gets a spear from them as well. Or the sword that he killed Goliath with.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the background of what Jesus is quoting here. What is the point that he's making? What is connecting those two stories together? Because David wasn't eating on the Sabbath.
No, instead he was lying to a priest.
He was lying to a priest. He was definitely lying to a priest.
Is it bad to lie on the Sabbath?
bad to
I'm
lie
sure
in
it's
general.
bad to lie on the Sabbath. I'm sure it's bad to lie just about any time.
Particularly to a priest.
But David didn't get in trouble for this, so I'm not going to get in trouble for this eating on the Sabbath? Is that the point?
No. He got away with it.
I think it was more, people tend to read that story and go, yeah, technically it wasn't legal, but it was still the right thing to do.
Would it have been the right thing for anybody to do?
No, but this was David.
This was David, and what was special about David?
David was the king. He was the Golden Age king.
And David had the right to reinterpret the law in order to fulfill human need.
Yeah.
In this instance. So he could not break, but reinterpret the law.
He was anointed at this stage.
Yes.
But he wasn't king at this stage.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So he had the kingly right, even though he wasn't acting as king in the office, he had been anointed. He had the right to reinterpret the law in order to fulfill human need. Now, Jesus has the same rights as David. This is a veiled messianic claim. Or at least the Pharisees would have understood it that way. You say that it was okay for David, in his kingly anointing, to reinterpret this law and lie to a priest and eat the sacrifice that was before God. And that was okay, because this was David. Well, I'm telling you, it's okay for me to rub this corn between my hands and eat it.
Because guess what? Son of David!
Yes. And to back up this proclamation, he's going to perform a healing on the Sabbath. So, Luke has arranged this with intent. Whether or not this actually happened one right after another, Luke has arranged this so that Jesus makes this very bold statement, and then he proves it, because he is going to perform a healing on the Sabbath, and he couldn't do that without God's stamp of approval. But this healing story that's going to come next here isn't actually about the healing at all. It's about the conflict between Jesus and the authorities over the Sabbath. So that's the context that this healing is going to happen in. And this man... Okay, we'll just go ahead and read it.
Because he's also claiming to be the Lord of the Sabbath.
Yes. Now it happened on another Sabbath, also, that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So his right hand is particularly a big deal because right hand dominant idea, so it's more severe than if it had been his left. Presumably this synagogue is in Capernaum from the context that we have in Mark. So he's there to teach and people are coming to hear. And here comes this guy with a withered right hand. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had a withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or destroy?" When he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Okay. So, things that were lawful on the Sabbath as far as medicine goes. You could have a baby. You were allowed to have a baby on Sabbath.
Well, that's good, because it'd be very difficult to...
That's good.
Yes. You were allowed to have a baby, and you were allowed to deliver a baby as a midwife. You were allowed to perform circumcision on the Sabbath. You were allowed to save a life by providing medical care on the Sabbath. So if somebody was dying, you were allowed to save their life. And that would include feeding them if they could not feed themselves. Things like that.
Ah, there's that traveler coming in again.
Yeah, well, yeah. Otherwise, healing was prohibited on the Sabbath. And he knows this. Jesus knows this. And Jesus knows that this is going to cause him trouble. And he knows that they're looking for a fight. He knew their thoughts. So he's smacking the beehive with a great big stick. And he knows it. It's not a surprise to him. So is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or destroy? Notice, the choice is not between doing good or doing nothing. It's between doing good or doing evil. There is no option to do nothing when you see a need. When you see a need, you either do good or you do not good, which is evil.
The lack of doing good is in itself evil.
The lack of doing good is in itself evil, exactly. So, it's kind of a rhetorical question, obviously. Luke doesn't even bother to mention that they stayed quiet. There's no need to answer a rhetorical question like that. And also, Luke doesn't mention any kind of anger or grief on the part of Jesus. He just looks around, challenges all of them, and then says, okay, stretch out your hand, and he heals the man. Very
Matter of fact.
very matter of fact on the part of Jesus. However, the Pharisees standing by are filled with senseless wrath. Luke has a very colorful vocabulary, so that it is senseless wrath. And the implication of their discussion is that they're at their wits' end and they just don't know what to do with him.
The point that really amazes me with all these stories, and there's many, many of them, and even the one back to where the guy was lowered through the roof,
Yep.
and they complained about that. What is better to do? To say your sins are forgiven, or to heal that lame person and say, get up and walk out, take your mat with you?
Yeah.
And now he's doing exactly the same thing. They are 120% completely focused on words on a piece of paper, for that matter, versus the miracle that happened right in front of him. And I can't say this for sure, but I'll be completely amazed that any one of those people that complain has ever seen that, or let alone laid hands on somebody for that.
There were a number of miracle workers in Jesus' day. Jesus was not the only miracle worker. It was actually a profession. There were people throughout the ages, we would start calling them apothecaries, or at one point we called them witches. People who would heal with herbal remedies, people who would heal with methods that were not part of the established medical practice, because the established medical practice would more often kill you than it would save you. So
a doctor wasn't called a miracle worker.
I'm sorry?
So a doctor wasn't called a miracle worker.
No, a doctor wasn't a miracle worker. A doctor was a medical professional, and they were just as likely to kill you as to save you.
Oh, this
Because-
person has bad blood.
What a-
Leeches.
It's just
Let's just
the rest
bleed them. They have a cold. Let's bleed them to death.
Oh, this person's acting crazy. Let's start drilling holes in their skull.
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah. So, there were a lot of people who were known for their ability to heal. And they might use miracle, or they might use herbal remedies, or we would call psychiatrists today psychologists, people who can help people to talk through their depression or their anxieties, or talk somebody down from a suicide, or I was just thinking a panic attack. Just talking somebody down from a panic attack.
Okay.
That all would have fallen under the category of miracle worker. So the fact that he's doing this, that he's doing these kinds of miracles, to us, we look at it with our modern Western scientific minds, and we say that is a miracle. But the Jews didn't even have a word for miracle. There is no word in Hebrew for miracle. You have the acts of God that are on the it makes sense level, and then you have the acts of God that are on the, well, we just don't get that level. But neither one of those implies an act that is against the normal way that nature works, as implied by a miracle. That concept just doesn't exist in Judaism. So they'd seen miracles before, and they didn't think that these miracles were necessarily anything more amazing than other miracles that they had seen, with the possible exception of things like Lazarus, or even more so, the blind, healing the blind, because healing the blind was something that only the Messiah was supposed to be able to do. Nobody had seen the blind given sight. That was one miracle that just did not happen. So that was a unique one. It was easier to raise the dead than it was to heal the blind. So they were okay with Jesus being a miracle worker, but when he started doing things like saying your sins are forgiven, that's a bigger problem for them. Or reinterpreting the law was a bigger problem.
Because now they're like, who the heck is this guy who keeps trying to take our authority?
Yeah. Verse 12, now it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer with God. Now that we've seen Jesus' relationship to his opponents, time to see his relationship to his disciples. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. He's got a crowd following him. He chooses 12 men from among them, from this great big crowd that's going to continue to follow him. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. Okay, couple of cool things in this list here. Simon, the leader who gets the primacy, and then Andrew his brother, Jacob and John. Jacob later named James. But if you look at it in the Greek, it's still Jacob. Does anybody know why we have
heard two versions of this. One is that it's supposedly still the same name.
No.
Which I don't
Not
believe.
even close.
The other is that when it was translated to English at the request of King James, he wanted somebody named after him, and particularly a particular book in the Bible to be named after him.
Yep. So, the guy's name was actually Jacob and John. But because King James of England wanted his name in the Bible, Jacob was renamed James.
We always like to get our own way.
Yeah, like to have our name in the Bible. So, yes, interesting little fact there. That's why James is a so not Hebrew or Greek name, and yet it is there in the New Testament in English. So, and then John...
Why then? Jesus was renaming everybody, so why doesn't someone else have a go at renaming you?
Jesus didn't rename everybody. He renamed a few.
Like,
He
I
didn't.
like your name.
rename
I'm gonna
everybody.
change this.
I mean, if I met someone and they said, today I'm going to now call you this, I would kind of raise an eyebrow and go, really?
Well, names...
To be fair, it was like, hey, what's up? My name is Pebble. Oh, well, you know what? From now on, I'm gonna call you The Rock.
Okay.
Names had a special significance that they don't really have for us today. Today, we're born, our parents give us a name, and that's the name that we use throughout our life. And sometimes we like it, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we use a nickname, but it's really just that's kind of what we've got. Back then, particularly in the Old Testament, you see it where when naming somebody is signifying ownership of them. So like when Daniel went into captivity, his name, Daniel, in Hebrew was changed to Chad. I just had it and it went shoo. His name was changed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Changed his name to something completely different. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego all had names given to them by the king of Babylon. Repeatedly, names get changed. When kings ruled, they had their name that they grew up with, and then they had their royal name that they used while they were on the throne. So
Jacob's name got changed to Israel.
yes, Jacob's name got changed to Israel even as far back as Genesis. So changing names is, it's very significant of something has changed, and it's usually a good change. You're usually moving up in the world when your name gets changed.
So it actually brings a question to me, is that all these books like this NIV here, it has been rewritten out of the King James Version, because the King James Version changed the James from Jacob to James, and this one has James written in it as well. That means that all subsequent versions have been rewritten from the King James Version.
Everyone in English has retained James rather than Jacob, simply because
It'll confuse people.
it would confuse the living daylights out of people to try to figure out. If you said, go to the book of Jacob in your Sunday morning service, everybody would be going, what? Nobody would be able to find it. So for consistency, all of the versions kept it. The versions, when they translate new versions of the Bible now, they decidedly don't look at the King James for reference or ideas on how they should translate, but they will retain James because just to keep
People from getting confused.
yeah. In other languages, it's still Jacob. Bibles in other languages, in Spanish, German, French, they'll all still be Jacob. They won't be James.
Okay.
Does James not
So
exist
why
in
is
that
Judas
in
Iscariot the only one whose last name is given?
Okay, I'll get there in a second. Actually, Philip and Bartholomew, son of Tholomew. That's likely his last name. Bartholomew is likely a last name. And he's possibly Philip's friend Nathanael, with whom he's mentioned in John. He also appears on the list of disciples. Nathanael appears on the list of disciples in John. But here we have Bartholomew, son of Tholomew. So probably his name was Nathanael Bartholomew, and they called him by his last name here. Judas, son of Jacob, is probably, or son of James, is probably Thaddeus in Mark's list. And the second one, the second Judas, is Judas, man of Kerioth. Can anybody tell me where Kerioth is? This is a neat little piece of trivia about Judas. It's a capital.
No, we were doing a pop quiz.
It's a capital city.
that exists now?
No.
No.
That existed then.
Everyone's Googling it right now.
Shut up. No.
Hezron, Hazor. It is the capital of Moab.
Huh.
Judas was a Moabite.
I imagine that has significance. I don't
Yeah,
Yes.
the Moabites were enemies
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
of
Ruth
the
was
Jews.
a Moabite.
yeah.
Yes, okay, that makes sense.
Ruth
Yes,
was the
I remember.
Moabitess. Yep. So Judas, man of Kerioth, Judas Ishkarioth, was the man from the capital of Moab. That's why his last name's given.
Just to cement the fact that this is a bad dude.
Yeah, and yet Jesus picked him.
Yep.
What's his name? Judas?
Judas Iscariot.
Iscariot, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So essentially, it's Judas the Moabite.
Man of Kerioth.
Yeah.
And Kerioth was the capital of Moab.
So, yeah. Basically, just painting the picture of saying like, hey, this guy was a Moabite, and then he turned traitor. Makes sense.
Yeah. All right. From here, we're going to get into the Sermon on the Plain. So we're just going to pause here and not get into this tonight. This Sermon on the Plain is probably the same as Matthew's Sermon on the Mount.
The Beatitudes.
Yeah, it's got a version of the Beatitudes, slightly different from Matthew's. In Mark, it takes place beside a sea, and in Luke, it takes place at the base of a mountain.
So geography and geology wasn't very high on their agenda there.
Nah, they had different points to make based on where they were putting it. So any one of the three writers may have put it in their particular setting to emphasize a particular point, whether it was by the sea or if they could have just been emphasizing the. They could have just been paying attention to the chronology, but I mean, Matthew would have him go up onto a mountain because you have encounters with God on top of mountains. Luke at the base of a mountain. You have Moses delivering the word of God to the people of Israel at the base of the mountain. So it's
also, I imagine if he was anything like some preachers and stuff these days, he probably preached this same message a number of times.
It's entirely possible. It is
different locations.
Yeah, true.
It is likely that even if this was the same instance, it was preserved in separate traditions, because when you get something preserved in an oral tradition, the preserving person will put it into verse and then will memorize it in that verse, that poem. And so different people will memorize it slightly different and create different oral traditions. So probably two different people hearing this same sermon, if it was one sermon at one time, two different people hearing the same sermon at the same time put it into verse in two different ways. So you get the same story, the same gist, but you get it in two different ways. So that's where we will start next time. At chapter 6, verse 17.